I forget. I hope I'm quoting him right. I'm paraphrasing. Uh, but he said that he'd been to the jungles and he had never seen a monkey convert to a human being. What was technically wrong in that statement? Anybody?
So the monkey is supposed to be like the brother species of humans, like
Correct. We didn't descend
they
from
have a common
monkeys or
ancestor.
chimpanzees, but it's that if we go back in time, there was a common ancestor, right? There was a common ancestor which was one species, and this one species then split into two. And these two species diverged as we move forward in time. And today, we human beings are one species, and chimpanzees is another species. So if we're only talking about chimps here, so these are two distinct species, which, if we go back in time, converge to one single common ancestor, where a speciation event took place, and this became two distinct species as we know them today, right? So what that means is that if us and chimps are connected by a common ancestor back in time, so this happened a few million years ago, right? And how do we know how long ago this happened is something that we cover in part 3 of this course, where we'll be talking about a concept called molecular clock. We can look at the DNA sequence of an organism so we can look at the DNA sequence of human beings and chimps, for instance, and derive conclusions about how far back in time must they have split from a common ancestor. Right. So we look at this. This was a concept that was proposed by Linus Pauling and Emil Zuckerkandl, famous paper of 1961. Uh, but the important point for our discussion is that these two species go back to a common ancestor some million years back in time. Similarly, now if we can also have another species, say horses and donkeys, they will go back and connect to a common ancestor some distance back in time. They will connect with cows some distance back in time, and so on and so forth. So if we take any two, so all the species that are existing today on the planet are called extant species, the ones that are present on the planet right now. Now, if we start going back in time, they keep collapsing, in the sense that we'll keep finding pairs which originated from a common ancestor. And if that collapse keeps on happening, what is the natural consequence that we'll eventually come to, Namrata?
One node.
One node, exactly. Perfect. So there will be all of this, if we go far back in time, will collapse to one node. That one node is called Luca, last universal common ancestor, because that's a universal common ancestor for everything on life that it exists as of now. Does that make sense?
Okay, but that may not be the first one.
It may not be the first one. So we say the last one. It's the most recent common ancestor.
Okay, is there a chance that there might be some other smaller trees compared to this big tree? And
Yeah, exactly. So definitely there will be other trees. Some of them collapsed because all of their branches went extinct. So you can think of it like this: that we started with a node, this branched off, and that branched off, and that branched off, and what we have today, right? Uh, but along the way, many of these branches, when a species goes extinct, so if this branching event took place, but this species went extinct, then this will keep on branching, but this went extinct, right? So you can think of it like a branching event taking place in space almost. And this is the time axis. So when you cut this tree at a particular time, you see all the existing species. But there are many nodes which didn't progress further. Species went extinct. So there are all those unknown branches of this tree that we don't know about. Does that make sense at all?
yes, sir.
Yeah, so that's Luca. And again, Luca is not a very old concept. It was called last common ancestor by one group. It was called universal common ancestor by another group. And by group, I mean a group of scientists. and nobody wanted to compromise. And I think a compromise was reached in 2001 when they decided to incorporate both the names and call it last universal common ancestor. So Luca is a fairly recent concept.
Okay, so is that identified or they have just named that root as Luca?
Yeah, so again, a tricky question. It's identified. It's definitely, the node is named as Luca. It's a concept. I don't think we can ever find out the exact composition of Luca. But what people are trying to do is sort of identify the first metabolic pathways. So we talked about hydrothermal vents. What people are trying to do is sort of trying to decipher how would biochemistry have originated in those prevailing, in those temperature, pressure, and chemical environment that are present in hydrothermal vents. And I wouldn't say we are very sure about it, but there are definitely some candidates of biochemical pathways which we think were the first pathways to sort of evolve in the most primitive organisms. So what people are trying to do is trying to understand these pathways and the appropriate enzymes which would help accomplish the necessary reactions for this pathway. And then you look for sort of the corresponding genes that would encode for these enzymes. So in this manner, you're trying to sort of come up with the genetic composition, was that what were the genes that were present in Luca in that in that environment where origin of life took place. But that's a difficult problem. We don't know a whole lot about it.
Okay.
I mean, if you think about it, we discussed, I mean, you and I discussed about the genetic code, right? The association between the triplets and the amino acid. Before Luca came, the genetic code would have come into being, because otherwise you don't have heredity storing. Otherwise, you can have enzymes formed by polymerization of amino acids, but you won't have the DNA repository which stores the information that this is the DNA molecule which encodes for this particular protein molecule, an enzyme. So genetic code would have had to evolve before Luca came into being. And again, because genetic code is universal, it must have evolved before Luca did. And we know very, very little about how genetic code came into being. So there are massive pieces of information missing from our understanding of how Luca came about. It's a really open question, really.
Okay.
Other questions?
No.
Others? Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
This is regarding sexual selection.
Yeah.
In Darwin's paper. So he suggested that there were three major traits that could be helpful in sexual selection. For example, the weapon trait, the shield, or so-called defensive trait, and the third one was more of certain traits that are just liked by the opposite species.
Yes.
So that would be, for example, the dancing, the
correct,
or how well you dance and stuff. So I'm just wondering, is there a correlation between the third type of traits and the healthiness of
the what? I missed the last bit. Your voice is not very clear, Anirudh. What was the last bit? The correlation between?
I'm just thinking whether this dancing or singing, these kind of traits, whether they confer some kind of physical healthiness. I mean, why is it that certain the opposite sex would prefer these traits, which do not necessarily have anything to do with whether healthiness, or do they have something to do with the healthiness?
Yeah. No, fair question. Is it okay if we come to this in sexual selection when we talk about that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, cool, great. But totally fair question. Yeah. Just a side note, because we'll discuss this when we come to sexual selection. Anyway, anything about what we have already talked about so far? Okay, let me also ask that why is it that some of you have not submitted the summaries? If you're too embarrassed to admit it in public, I would like to know. You can write to me and we can talk. Otherwise, but I would like to know. All right, cool. So if there are no more questions, let's pick up our story. Let me share my screen. I did say that I wanted to cover one story that happened in the immediate aftermath of publication of Origin of Species before we move ahead. So what happened was that Origin of Species gets published. There are about 1,200 copies of the book which are sold on day one, and it's a big hit. And there's a usual backlash that Darwin had anticipated, but nothing majorly disturbing. The backlash was almost primarily from the clergy, and but at the scientific levels, there was admiration for the theory, fairly well expected. Of course, there was scientific criticism also, but nothing to get too disturbed about. Darwin had been writing to and communicating with gardeners for the longest time. He would ask them about that, how do you breed these flowers? You get these pretty ones when you do this, and he wanted to understand their intuition because he was introduced in the concept of how is variation introduced in physical traits, and what happened is that when the Origin of Species was published in 59, in the following year, Darwin received a letter. Not Darwin. Darwin had always subscribed to this magazine called Gardener's Chronicle and Agricultural Gazette. And in the year after the publication of Origin, the Origin was published in 1859 November, and in the March issue, Gardener's Chronicle contained a review of the book. And in the following month's edition, a guy called Patrick Matthew wrote a letter to the editor of this magazine. And it's worthwhile that we sort of read this paragraph from his letter. It was published in 1860. He says that, in your number of March, I observed a long quotation from the Times stating that Mr. Darwin, quote, professes to have discovered the existence and modus operandi of the natural law of selection. That is, quote, the power in nature which takes the place of man and performs selection in organic life. Quote ends. The discovery recently published as the result of 20 years' investigation and reflection by Darwin turns out to be what I published very fully and brought to apply practically to forestry in my work, Naval Timber and Arboriculture, published in 1831 by so-and-so and reviewed in numerous periodicals, so-and-so. The following is an extract from this volume, which clearly proves a prior claim. So Patrick Matthew was a Scotsman who had inherited his family timber forestry, and he was concerned about maintaining Britain's dominance over the rest of the world at the time, and he was convinced that in order for Britain to do it, she needed an extremely strong navy, and for that it was imperative that we produced the best quality timber. And in that context, he wrote a book called On Naval Timber and Arboriculture. And in this book, there is a small section where the question is about how do we grow better timber, and better being defined as whatever is most suitable for naval purposes. And he writes to this magazine that, look, there is a book that I published almost 30 years back, and in this book I outline this theory. So there is nothing new in what Darwin is saying, and I claim a prior having arrived to this theory prior to what Darwin did. So Darwin, of course, reads this letter because it's in the magazine that he subscribes to, and he writes back. So in the following month's article, he writes that I have been much interested by Patrick Matthews's communication in the April issue. I freely acknowledge that Mr. Matthew has anticipated by many years the explanation which I have offered of the origin of species under the name of natural selection. I think that no one will feel surprised that neither I nor apparently any other naturalist had heard of Mr. Matthew's view, considering how briefly they are given and that they appeared in the appendix to a work on naval timber and arboriculture. I can do no more than offer my apologies to Mr. Matthew for my ignorance of his publication. If another edition of my work is called for, I will insert a notice to the foregoing effect. So Darwin concedes here that Matthew was the first one to have arrived at the theory, and says that in subsequent editions, I will talk about this. So by the time this happened, Darwin had already started sort of getting close to the completion of the second edition. And in third edition onwards, Darwin added a section to the book, which is historical views on origin of species. And he starts from Aristotle and discusses a lot of natural philosophers from the 18th century. And in this note, he does talk about Matthew and his work on natural selection in this book titled from 1831. Interestingly enough, the only record that we have is that in subsequent to publication of Matthew's book, what happened was that the book was banned in a library in Australia. So apparently, and the thought is that apparently the librarian or somebody there got a clue of what Matthew was trying to say, and it sounded very blasphemous, that species are not mutable, they are not created and placed on earth by a god, and so on and so forth. But for the most part, Matthew is sort of a forgotten figure in the history of science. As far as this communication is concerned, there is one more follow-up that Matthew wrote in reply to Darwin's letter. And in the next month's letter, Matthew, I think this is hilarious. Matthew writes that, to me, the conception of this law of nature came intuitively as a self-evident fact, almost without an effort of concentrated thought. Mr. Darwin here seems to have more merit in the discovery than I have, because to me it did not appear a discovery. He seems to have worked it out by inductive reason, slowly and with due caution, to have made his way synthetically from fact to fact onwards. So he's just elaborating that Darwin has spent so much time thinking about this, has gathered so much evidence. That's been Darwin's style at how he arrived at theory of natural selection. While with me, it was by a general glance at scheme of nature that I estimated this select production of species as an a priori recognizable fact. So he's calling it a fact, an axiom, and then he says that natural selection is an axiom requiring only to be pointed out to be admitted by unprejudiced minds of sufficient grasp. And the conversation sort of ended there. Matthew is definitely a forgotten figure in history of evolutionary thought. And despite all his attempts at trying to leverage some attention and be recognized for having arrived at theory of natural selection before Darwin, he didn't get any dues. And in a famous story, he published his visiting cards prior to this exchange, and under his name he wrote that solver of the origin of species problem, Patrick Matthew, solver of the origin of species problem. But that's how science works. Sometimes these things happen. All right. Great. So we end this, and now we'll discuss chapter 3. Any questions, comments? All right. So what's happening in theory of natural selection? Yeah.
Like last day you were talking about Darwin, Wallace, and Bates.
Yes.
Like Bates and Matthew are the same guy, or no?
No. So Bates is still in South America. Matthew is a Scotsman who's never left Great Britain. I mentioned Bates. I skipped talking about him. What Bates? So Bates was in South America all this time while all of this was going on, and he wrote a book. He discovered thousands of species in South America. He wrote a book describing all those species, and his connection with the theory of natural selection is that after 1859, he's still in South America. He reads Darwin's book, and he thinks it's fantastic. And he sends Darwin a paper where he talks about something called Batesian mimicry. Have you heard of this term before?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, others? So in Batesian mimicry, what's happening is that, well, Batesian mimicry because it was noted by Bates. What Bates noted was that in certain regions, you had poisonous and non-poisonous butterflies. And if a predator came, and obviously the predator is not, natural selection has shaped things that the predator wouldn't touch the poisonous butterflies, but would only eat the non-poisonous ones. But then, because natural selection would shape things that way, but the only way for the predator to recognize that this one is poisonous and this one is not poisonous is by looking at the physical appearance and the color and the size of the butterfly. Those are the only appearances. So Bates noticed in a particular setting in South America that this was happening. So the predator would come, wouldn't touch this kind of a butterfly, but would eat only that kind of a butterfly. That was because the predator knew. But then how evolution played out was that there was variation in color in, let's say only color, that the two poisonous and non-poisonous are only differentiated by color. And what happened was that Bates noticed that the non-poisonous ones had variation in color, right? So if we just talk about one particular color, this is the strength of the shade. This is the distribution that you see in the poisonous ones. This is the distribution that you see in non-poisonous ones. Now, the non-poisonous ones, which kind of by chance looked like poisonous ones. They weren't poisonous, but it's just that their color happened to look like the ones that are poisonous. The predator wouldn't touch. So all the colors, all the non-poisonous ones, which looked very different from the poisonous ones, were eaten up. Whereas the non-poisonous ones, which kind of looked like the poisonous ones, were not touched by the predator, right? So what happened was, eventually you got a mix of the population where you had poisonous and non-poisonous ones. And now it was very hard for you to be able to distinguish that which butterfly is a poisonous one and which one is a non-poisonous one. So this is sort of and Bates call it mimicry by the non-poisonous ones of the ones that do actually possess the poison. So this concept is called Batesian mimicry, right? So he sent Darwin a paper with all of this described, and he says that, look, all the scientific critique that you are facing regarding origin of species doesn't really make sense, because natural selection is true. And here is an example of natural selection in action right before my eyes, and here I describe it to you. And Darwin noticed that, and of course he was happy to receive any support that he could, and he was always sort of hungry for more data and empirical evidence. And Darwin wrote back to Bates that your paper is remarkable. It's one of the most beautiful papers I've ever read. So that's where Bates comes into being. But Henry Bates and Patrick Matthew, different guys. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah.
All right. All right. Let's talk about theory of natural selection. So what becomes very apparent is that very early on, Darwin is talking about variation. And variation is the key to natural selection. In a population where there is no variation in a physical trait, and that physical trait could be anything, eye color, height, weight, how tall are your limbs, anything, there will be variation. And if we take a population of any particular city, and if I plot a frequency distribution of this of any trait, let's say height, if I plot a frequency distribution where all I'm asking is that of all the, let the total number of individuals be n total, nt, and what I'm plotting here is that how many individuals among this nt have height between h1 and h2, and that number is n1 here. Then I'm saying how many individuals have height between h2 and h3, that number is n2, n3, and so on and so forth. So I can get a complete distribution of height in a population. This is called a frequency distribution of anything. In this case, it happens to be a physical trait in a population, which is height. Does this graph make sense? I want to make sure that everybody, including the biologists, get this graph, because this is sort of going to be the key. This will keep, these distributions are going to keep arriving at us throughout the semester.
Yes, sir.
Everybody okay with it?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Cool. So this is one way to plot it. Another way to plot it is that what I do is sort of divide all of these, divide all of these bars by the total number, by the total population. So the height of the first bar in this case is going to be n1 divided by nt. The height of the second bar is going to be n2 divided by nt. So what that tells me is that what is the percentage, or what is the fraction of the population that is from height h1 to h2. What is the fraction of the population which has height from h2 to h3, and so on and so forth. So this is absolute numbers distribution, and this is the distribution in terms of fraction or percentage of population. Of course, these two graphs are going to look exactly alike. The only difference is that it's numbers here, and it's everything normalized by a factor nt here. And this distribution can be defined by what is called a normal distribution, which is this bell-shaped curve, which all of you, I'm sure, have looked at some point. And a normal distribution is characterized by two parameters. The first one is what is the mean. So we can ask ourselves what is the mean height of the population. And the second parameter is what is the standard deviation associated with it. Again, for those of you who are not from quantitative background, you can think of it like this, that suppose there are 100 people in this class, and I take an exam and everybody gets 50. So the average is obviously 50. And then I take a second exam, and now half the students get 0 and half the students get 100. The average is still 50. But these two distributions are extremely different from each other. And the parameter that characterizes this is sort of what is the distribution of this of the marks around the mean, because the mean is the same in both these scenarios. And what we're asking, what in a normal distribution sigma defines is that what is the spread of the, in this case, trait around the mean. Is everybody bunched together near the mean of the height, or is the population spread really wide and the mean happens to be one particular value? If you need to look up normal distribution, please do that. Again, this is something that will come again and again. So let me ask you this now. If let's imagine this is the graph of a height distribution in a city. Why does this variation exist? What factors do you think are responsible for this variation?
Sexual selection.
What do you mean by that?
So, as individuals, by their own preference, meet with other individuals with similar height or a smaller height or a bigger height. So, because of this difference in the mating process, there are different types of heights seen in their offsprings of different pairs.
Yeah.
And sexual selection accounts for this variation in a character trait.
Yeah, sure. So one of the reasons could be that you have variation because as there is sexual selection operating, that either one likes to mate with another person of the same height, or there is a preference for shorter mates or taller mates, and this sort of biases the distribution from it being much sharper around the mean, and hence you get variation. That's possible. What else? What else could cause this variation?
So if not specifically talking about height, then in general, there are a lot of changes happening in the environment. So one of these variations may favor the successful survival and perpetuation.
Okay. Well, just to be clear, what I'm talking about here is not so much natural selection. If we for a moment forget natural selection, we are not talking of fitness or any sort of selection operating. But if I just say, like, let me ask you this: do you think today height is a trait in human beings which is being selected for? No, right? My guess would be no. If anything, it would probably a very, very weak correlation. It doesn't necessarily enhance or reduce my fitness. But variation exists, right? So this is a trait. This is a trait. Are all of you sort of reasonably comfortable with the assumption that height is not related to fitness in human beings today? It might have been 20,000 years ago when we were all, living a nomadic lifestyle. But today it doesn't seem like it. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
All
sir.
right. So this is a trait. Then we are all on the same page. Then we say that we have a trait which is not linked with selection at all, right? But still variation exists, right? Why does this variation exist? And again, I'm talking from a context independent of natural selection. So before I answer that, Adishri, did you have a question?
Yeah, I didn't have a question. I meant to say nutrition. Maybe that is a.
Yeah, sure. Perfect. Okay, great. Yeah, so why does variation exist?
Sir, there is also a probability that higher means person with high greater heights will mate with somebody with similar heights. So variations also, and shorter people will like shorter mate.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but that happens in Indian population at least.
Sure.
So
Yeah, go ahead, Sakshi.
so maybe like today we know some traits are linked. So maybe because one trait is being evolved along with it, it may be together
Sure.
evolved.
Sure. Perfect. Great. Fine. So I think between all of this, we have. So Adishri, your answer is perfect. That height is definitely a trait which is affected by environment. especially in the context in a in a in a population which is sort of economically so stratified, such as ours. You could be born in a family where you're fed well, you're taken care of, hygiene is clean, or you could be born in a population where you're sort of struggling to make ends meet and you barely get food to survive, and so on and so forth. And that's definitely going to have impact on how tall you are. And in the context that we want to look at it, what we want to say here is that if I was raised in scenario 1 where everything was taken care of, I would probably grow to be taller, compared to if I, with the same gene, so the genetic makeup doesn't change at all. But if I had an identical twin which was raised in those malnourished conditions, poor hygiene, poor food, my identical twin would probably not grow up to be as tall as me, right? So that's the effect, that's the consequence of environment dictating a trait of the population, and that could introduce variation. Buddhadev, let me ask you this. Why were there tall and short people to begin with? As you mentioned, a tall person, statistically speaking, I agree, would probably want to mate with a taller person. But why was there variation to begin with?
So I was not. I didn't understand the question. Yes.
What you're talking about is a bias in who one wants to mate with, right?
Yes.
And a taller person, you say, might want to also mate with a taller person, a shorter person with a shorter person. While that's fine, but why were there these tall and short people to begin with?
Means I think there are some criteria of sexual selection that we see that means not sure. Means there are some criteria which we select somebody to mate with. In case height is a great.
No. We don't want to go into mating. We want to understand why is there variation. So
So
the
short people can have like, this is my assumption, they might have like larger surface area, so the energy consumption by short people will be less than compared to tall people, given the given resources. So short people are more efficient. So that's why maybe in this very cold places also you'll see more shorter people.
Yeah.
Like for example, Mongoloids are shorter than if you see people from South America or Brazil where there is tropical climate. I don't know whether this is true.
I don't know either, but I wouldn't place a bet on it, because I would imagine Icelanders are much more taller than us. No, so I guess I maybe I'm not posing this right. Yeah, Anirudh, go ahead.
If we consider height to be a random variable,
Yeah.
then it automatically forms a normal distribution. So there is going to be a certain trait of tallness and shortness. And biologically speaking, this happens because of sexual, because each father and mother provide one chromosome each, which causes variation and then recombination. But essentially, I think because if it's not chosen for, then it's a random variable.
Correct.
So also I believe that the height doesn't actually has any relation with the fitness until there are some problem with the genetic makeup or any diseases particularly. So a population will have a minimum mean height. For Indians, it will be something like 5.5 to 6 or something like that. For
Two questions for all of you. Does your empirical observation suggest that taller people tend to have taller children?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes.
Why is that?
That's just genetics. Like
Yes, and that's what I was getting at. That the other reason for variation is genetics, right? The genes that I inherit from my parents. So just as my identical twin and I are going to probably grow up to different heights depending on in what sort of environment we were raised, my non-identical twin and I are also going to grow up to different heights. Now the environment is identical because we were born and raised at the same time in the same family, but our genetic composition is different now. So height is a trait which has variation in a population because of genetic reasons and because of environmental reasons. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right, great, fantastic. If that is the case, you guys have been using the word fitness. What does fitness mean? If I asked you for a clear, simple definition of fitness, what would you say? Yes, go ahead.
So if individuals are more aligned and more suitable to live in the
What
surroundings,
does suitable mean?
More readily adapting.
yeah,
Favorable variations.
It
They
would
can
be like
adapt
better
with the
performance
change.
in everything.
Akanksha?
Yeah, I'm saying a better performance in every single action, day-to-day life actions.
Okay. Um,
I I think it means they're producing more offsprings. That would be
absolutely. Yes, that has to be it. Greater fitness. Fitness, I want you guys to think of fitness as simply what Anirudh just said, that how many offsprings do you leave behind? That's your fitness. If I am endowed with such great genes and environment that I will grow to live to 150, but I'm sterile, I can't produce a kid, I have zero fitness, right? So I might have all the traits in the world which are going to help me live the best possible life, but if I can't produce an offspring, my fitness is zero, right? So in terms of, so that's, I want to think of fitness in 2 or 3 different ways. And this is the first way, that we're going to talk about fitness as number of offsprings that you leave behind. Anybody has any questions with that?
So that is just reproductive fitness that we are talking about.
Yes, there is no other kind of fitness. Okay.
And is the fitness compared among the same species, or like can you compare a fitness of one organism with a completely different organism?
You tell me.
Like in my opinion, you shouldn't. But
So yeah.
like you can't say that like something which reproduces at a faster rate has more fitness than something like a completely different like amoeba compared to a human or something like that.
Yeah. So I think again it's context dependent. The example you cite, I agree with. I don't think it makes sense for us to compare fitnesses, but let's compare fitness of human beings and wolves living in a jungle. I mean, you are from campus. We know leopards come into campus, and if we didn't do anything about it, and leopards number grew, that automatically means that human being population is going to go down. Now we are going to control their numbers either through forceful ways or through natural ways. But in that case fitness matters, right?
Yeah, okay.
If the leopard fitness is like 10, everybody is giving birth to 10 new leopards, then we are going to have a big problem, and human being fitness will go down on campus. I mean, a campus is sort of an artificial creation because most of the residents like yourself come to campus, live for a short bit and move away. But think of it like a city where residents are permanently stationed there, and then the fitness of these two cannot both increase. And I think there would be a correlation between fitness of one versus the other. But you're right in the sense that that comparison doesn't make sense in every context. Comparing growth rate of amoeba and human beings is probably not going to, doesn't make any sense. Is that okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Sakshi?
No, sir.
Okay, I thought you had a question. Fine.
So,
Yeah.
is fitness only the ability to make children or the number of children that it makes?
No, so fitness is not the ability. Fitness. So we want to come up with because after this section 1 of the course, we are going to make this. We are going to try and make this whole thing quantitative. We're going to write down equations to understand the dynamics of evolution, and we will be asked to choose a quantitative definition of fitness. So fitness of an individual is just how, on an average, how many offsprings will this individual leave behind when he or she dies? Okay, so compare A and B. So I actually have this. Okay, let me complete this discussion first. So fitness is not ability, because ability can be that one person can barely have one child, right? So in case of human beings, suppose my sperm count is very low, I'm not very likely to have children. So, I only have one child in my lifetime. But there's another person who has a very good sperm count and has 6 children. So definitely our fitness is very, because in the next generation, while this person was 1 and I was 1, so our ratio was 1:1. But in the next generation, I only produced 1 offspring, that guy produced 6 offsprings. So the ratio of the two genotypes or the 2 type of variants has become 1:6 now. So fitness is definitely a quantitative measure and not a qualitative measure.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So we need to understand this a couple more. We need to have a couple more points to discuss about this. How would you describe fitness if you're talking of bacterial populations? Because for those of you who don't know, bacteria don't need a partner to mate. They divide asexually. So you just have a bacteria which just grows bigger and it divides, it pinches off in the middle, and now you have 2. So in that sense, so with me, there is a clear demarcation that I will produce offsprings, I will die then, and then my offsprings will continue to propagate or may not or whatever. Excuse me. So in sexually producing populations, there is a clear hierarchy that you go from generation to generation, and that's a sort of a fitness that we are talking about, that before I die, how many offsprings am I going to produce? That's a measure of fitness. But how would you define fitness for a bacteria?
The rate at which.
Yeah, Adishri, go ahead.
Yeah, the time required to divide. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So fitness would be inversely related to the time needed for division.
Yes.
Buddha,
also the factors that it is growing, means if it could
Environment.
grow in different kind of cultures or not, means is it auxotrophic or not? There are many things.
Sure. So you could grow the same bacteria in extremely rich media where it divides every 30 minutes, or you could grow the same bacteria in poor media where it divides every 1 hour, and obviously the fitness has decreased. But the question, essentially the definition remains as what Adishri just said, that fitness, when we are talking of asexually reproducing organisms, we can think of fitness as somehow inversely related to the time it takes for the organism to divide. That's perfect.
Sir, I have a question. Suppose same species, but one kind of a colony or one kind of a strain is growing without some particular amino acid. It produces one, means methionine, and one needs to be provided methionine or something like that. So I think which one will be more fitter? Can't we say that one which grows without methionine is much fitter?
That sort of brings us to an important concept that we have to keep in mind every time we're talking of fitness throughout the course, and not just throughout the course. Whenever you are thinking of fitness in any context, that fitness is not a property of an individual. I mean, it is a property of an individual, but you cannot think of fitness of an individual, period. When you're talking of fitness, you have to think of fitness of an individual in a particular environment. Okay? Without the environment part at the end, the concept of fitness doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Let me give you an example. So what Buddhadev is asking is, he says that there are two types of bacteria. One of the bacteria can make methionine by itself, so it doesn't need to, it's not dependent on the environment to get methionine from it. The other kind doesn't make methionine. These guys are called auxotrophs, which cannot make something essential for growth. So they are dependent on methionine from environment. Now, if these two are growing in an environment where methionine is present, so you can simply take up methionine from the environment, which one will grow faster? Anybody?
Which can take methionine directly.
Yeah, one which is able to take from the
I
environment.
think both of them would go in the same way.
Why is that?
My assumption, because I mean, one bacteria does not produce methionine, but it can use it from the environment. So I'm guessing that it would only use as much as it's capable of at any particular time.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was thinking if it is readily available, they don't have to produce it. Both organisms can readily take it from the environment.
Correct. So in this context, I mean, we can do some nitpicking and stuff, but really for all experimental purposes, both will grow at the same rate, because the one that has all the necessary enzymes to produce methionine is not going to produce methionine, because it can sense, it has sensors, it can sense that methionine is in the environment. So it's going to control its gene expression in such a way that the enzymes which are necessary for making methionine are not expressed, because they're not needed. Methionine is there in the environment. So why spend resources on making an enzyme when you can simply import methionine and use it for growth and repair purposes? So for all practical purposes, they will grow at the same rate. However, if you want to put an argument that, and this has been noted experimentally actually, suppose you grow E. coli in an environment where there is plenty of methionine and no other amino acid. So all other 19 amino acids E. coli needs to make, but methionine is there in excess in the extracellular environment surrounding the bacteria. If you grow this E. coli for a long time, what might happen regarding the capability of the bacteria to produce methionine? Is the question clear?
The capability would reduce.
Yeah, so what might happen down the line, that a variant might get produced, which basically has lost the part of DNA which contains the sequence for the enzyme to produce methionine. And let's imagine that this sequence is 3000 bases long. So in the process of replication, and I'm talking a long-term experiment, at least a few hundred generations. In that process, what might happen is that a variant might come which has lost the 3000 bases which are necessary for encoding the enzyme that produces methionine. Now this variant is going to be fitter than the others, because when it's copying its DNA is actually smaller than everybody else's. So the amount it has to spend on DNA replication is smaller than everybody else in the population, and hence it has lesser costs associated with growth, and it would have a slightly higher fitness compared to everybody in the population. So you started with the population, and then because it is fitter than everybody else, it's going to outcompete everybody else and take over the population. Does that scenario make sense? Anirudh, what would you say?
Yes, sir.
So that would mean the fitness itself is a very dynamic situation in this case.
Yeah, no,
I think-
fitness is totally a dynamic, is a totally a dynamic parameter. It's dependent on everything.
Yeah.
And much of this course is going to be a discussion on, how interplay between environment changes fitness, how once you take a step up in fitness, what does that mean for future trajectories of evolution of fitness, all sorts of things. So fitness is very dynamic. In this particular case, the cost of making DNA is actually not a big part of the energy budget of a cell. So of all the energy that's produced inside the cell, about 60 to 70% is actually spent on making proteins. So if you can save on making proteins, that's a big energy cost that you have saved. DNA replication is only about 2 to 3% of the energy cost of the entire cell. So in terms of cost, the advantage that this is going to produce is actually going to be very, very small.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, depending on how we think about it, this methionine making guy and methionine not making guy have sort of roughly the same fitness in the environment where methionine is present. What would you say about the fitness of these two variants in an environment where there is no methionine?
So the one without the methionine would be way less fitter.
Right. So in this case, if there is no methionine in the media, then the one that doesn't make methionine has zero fitness because it can't grow. Right? It takes infinite time to divide, and hence 1 upon infinity, its growth rate is 0. So in one environment, the fitness was the same. In another environment, the fitness of one of them is 0. If I do the same experiment, but add methionine, but I'm doing this at 100, if I'm doing this experiment in boiling water, again, fitness of both of them is 0, and methionine is present now. So fitness is a concept which is totally dependent on the context in which you are measuring it, the precise environment you are measuring in. And when we talk about environment, it's not just the physical and the chemical environment, it's also the biological environment. We will see cases where presence of another species in the environment changes the fitness of one of them, changes the fitness of another species. So there is communication going on between different species and so on and so forth. And we can sense that in an ecosystem, if we imagine a jungle where all species are interacting with each other. So it's not just the physical and chemical environment, but also definitely the biological environment too. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
All right, questions?
Sir,
Yes.
if for a long time the methionine making bacteria did not come in contact with external methionine, it might not be capable to use the external methionine, right? What if the cellular machinery doesn't favor it?
That's an interesting question. Theoretically speaking, what you are saying makes perfect sense. If you asked me that, could this be the way it plays out? I think it could. Having said that, I have not seen any report where something like this has been tested or seen in an experiment. But that's an interesting thought. I can think of some reasons why an experiment like that will be very hard to design, and you will run into some challenges. Pavitra, if you remind me about this question in a month's time, I would like to discuss this. Okay?
Sure, sir.
Yeah, no, but conceptually speaking, what you are saying makes perfect sense. But there are other issues which might prevent from you designing an experiment where this could be seen. But let's discuss this in a few weeks' time when we've made a little more inroad into the course. Okay?
What was the question?
The question is that if you are growing E. coli which is capable of making methionine in an environment where there is no methionine, would it lose the ability to transport methionine? I mean, if you did it for a really long time, would it grow into a strain which is incapable of transporting methionine now?
By that you mean it cannot take up methionine from environment at all?
Yeah, so you typically have dedicated transporter proteins which are embedded in the membrane for transport of specific things. So you have a transporter for glucose, you have a transporter for lactose, and you have transporter for various different things. The question is that because it has not used the methionine transporter for thousands of generations, and there is no selection pressure because the environment doesn't have any methionine, would it lose then the methionine transporter? Akshat, comments?
Sir,
Hang on a second. Akshat, so ya kya?
Nahi, so you mean like the gene encoding for the transporter can be lost because?
Yes, because there is no selective advantage.
But there is no selective disadvantage.
That's what we are saying, right? The disadvantage could only be that if you lost that gene, if you just deleted that piece of DNA, you don't have to copy that piece of DNA every time a cell divides. So that's a minuscule advantage, but that's the question.
So it doesn't have to produce that particular protein also right now.
Correct, but it does have to copy the piece of DNA. If it lost that piece of DNA, it wouldn't have to replicate that piece of DNA every time.
Yeah, no, but you mentioned that most of the energy is
absolutely no, absolutely. DNA cost is not very much. Yeah,
I think there would be a biased fluctuation of this particular trait. I mean, you would see more species not having the transporter maybe in an environment, but you would have a minority population still having this particular trait.
Yeah, no, fair. Again, Pavitra, just remind me in a month's time. I do want to discuss this, but I want to discuss it in the context of some of the things that we're going to talk about in a few weeks' time. So, it would be we're not prepared for that discussion just yet, but in a few weeks' time. Okay?
Sir?
Yes.
Just a last insight about it. That is that I think I've read somewhere, I forgot whose theory was that the use and non-use doesn't make sense. Means we have appendix that we don't use, but it's still there. So, and as methionine is a very important for organism to grow, I don't think it will never lose it. Means it will still keep it.
So use and disuse is Lamarck that we will discuss on Friday. Your second comment about that methionine is very important and hence it will never use it is exactly how we should not think of evolution. Because when evolution happens, you either lose something, you gain something. What we have to keep in mind at all times is that evolution has no foresight. When it happens, you are not thinking that, oh, this is too critical for me to lose. I might need it some other day in the future. It is happening with absolutely no foresight. Everything that is happening, every selection that is happening is for here and now. If losing methionine gives you an advantage, if losing that methionine gene gave you a 2% growth advantage over everybody else in the population, your competitors, 2% is a huge advantage. You would lose it. That mutation will be seen in the population in no time. So we are not going to. That's an important point actually, that we will not associate evolution with foresight. It doesn't. Evolution is blind, as Richard Dawkins synthesis. Prachita, you had a question?
No, sir. But isn't this similar to the example that we were discussing earlier, where a new variant would be formed if, like the methionine thing, where if methionine was supplied, then the variant which would actually make methionine will lose its gene.
Same, exactly. Same. This is the same discussion, but what Pavitra has asked is basically switched it on its head.
Yeah, just as we assume that.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. That in a conceptual, in a theoretical framework, sure, it could work.
Yeah.
In practical terms, the first problem is what we talked about earlier, that by losing the gene, the advantage you get is minuscule, is really small. DNA synthesis is a fairly inexpensive process as far as cellular energy budgeting is concerned. So that doesn't give you a huge advantage. But what I'm saying is that I want to discuss it in a few other contexts also, which we're not ready for just yet.
Rather than
Akshat.
Rather than losing the gene, isn't it more likely that, given that there is no selective pressure, it will just acquire mutations and lose its function but still be present?
Yeah, but that doesn't let me make the claim that it's going to save on energy by not having to synthesize that DNA. So that's what I'm saying, that let's imagine that it just lost the entire gene.
Slight advantage, but
sure. No, fair point. I agree. Okay.
So I just
Sakshi, quickly, because we are running out of time and I do want to discuss a couple of other things.
Yes, I was saying that it may require a very long time because already it might have been a favorable variation for the same bacteria.
Yes, all fair. No questions. Yeah, cool. So we have definitions of fitness now. One is, when I'm talking of myself, we can think of the number of offsprings I leave behind before I die. In bacteria, it has to be thought of slightly differently. Interestingly, when Darwin talked about fit of an organism with an environment, he thought of fitness not in these quantitative terms, inverse of growth rate or number of offsprings. The way he's thinking about fitness is like how a hand fits in a glove. Like glove is the environment, hand is the organism. How good is that fit? That's a qualitative description of fitness. Well, let me just quickly go through these notes. So we have variation in a trait. This variation we saw that could be because of environment, could be because of genetics. Which type of variation do you guys think is more relevant for evolution?
Environment based.
Okay, we have one environment, one genetics.
Genetics.
Okay, so let's just walk through. So we discussed this. All of this is fine. I will post these. I will post these notes on Moodle so you guys can take a look. This is what I want to discuss: that elements of theory of natural selection. For natural selection to work, the following conditions need to be met. First is that variation must exist in a trait in a population. So if there is no variation, every individual is identical, then natural selection has nothing to select for. It's going to treat everybody the same. Everybody survives or everybody dies. Second is that because of this variation, some trait values should be more fit than others. Okay, so let's discuss this in a context of a real example: industrial melanism. You guys have heard of this?
Yes, so there was industrial revolution.
Sure. Anybody who hasn't heard of it, quickly raise your hands. I'll do it in a minute. All right, there are a few people. All right. So what happened in sort of 19th century England is that because massive industrialization was taking place, so areas around the cities, places like Manchester, Liverpool, these are essentially industrial towns. There was a lot of smoke coming out from these industries. and this smoke was settling on tree trunks. And if in tree trunks which were lighter in color, this colored moth was found because it blended in very well with the color of the trunk, and there was camouflage, so it would help it survive against the predators. But as black smoke settled on the trunks, these guys became increasingly visible, and this colored moth became more prevalent in the population, whereas earlier it was this colored moth which was more prevalent. This was a minority, but as more and more black smoke sort of settled on trunks, this became more prevalent. And this, why do you think this was so? I mean, I'll answer. Because camouflage helped protect one particular variety. When the color of the background changed, it protected the other kind and not the lighter kind. So you were more visible to the predator. There was more chances of you being picked up and eaten up, and hence your fitness decreased. In this case, your fitness decreased not because of struggle for resources, as Darwin says. Remember, Darwin was influenced by Malthus's essay about struggle, that population increases exponentially, food resources increase linearly, hence there is struggle for food. But struggle could operate by other ways also. In this case, the struggle is to leave behind more offsprings before you are eaten up by a predator, right? So this is an example where the trait that we are talking about, this variation exists. So variation exists in a trait, and trait is a color on the moth. And this trait imparts different fitness to individuals with different trait values. So if we could somehow quantify the color as a shade of black, in the earlier setting, the lighter shades were more fit, but in the later setting, when smoke settled on trunks, the darker shades were more fit. So trait value is linked with fitness now. Then Darwin says individuals with favorable trait values, so these two need to be satisfied, then individuals with favorable trait will leave behind more offsprings than others, which is easy to see. After the smoke has settled down, the darker shade moths will leave more offspring than the lighter one. And the last condition for natural selection to operate is that it must have a genetic component. That the individuals which were born with the darker shade, they must leave behind progeny which are also darker in color. If in one generation a darker colored moth sort of survived, and then it's going to leave behind more offsprings. But if the color of offspring is independent of the color of the parents, then selection didn't happen. The color of its offspring is going to be randomly chosen. But if there is a genetic link between the offspring's phenotype and the parent's phenotype, then darker colored moths are also going to produce darker colored children moths. Then gradually you're going to see that the population is increasingly comprised of darker colored moths as compared to the lighter colored moths. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Anybody to who it didn't make sense? Let me know, I'll be happy to repeat, but this is important. All right, cool. So for natural selection to operate, these three conditions have to be met. Variation must exist. This variation must be linked with fitness. So we said that in today's world, height of human beings is independent of fitness. If that is true, and I don't know if that is true or not, but if that is true, then condition one is satisfied, that variation exists, but some trait values are more fit than others. This is not satisfied. Natural selection cannot operate on height of human beings. We may choose to disagree or agree, but for argument's sake, let's take it that way. The third is not really a point, it's just an extension of these two. If some trait values are more fit, then obviously the more fit guys are going to leave more offsprings than others. So this is just a natural consequence of 1 and 2. And the fourth point is that this trait must have a genetic component. Only then would the surviving variants leave behind offsprings which are also carrying the more favorable trait, and hence you have change in the color of the moth from light to dark as industrial mannerism operates. Okay. All right. If that is clear, I had a couple of examples of evolution. Industrial mechanism. Darwin's finches is basically the birds finches that he saw on Galapagos Island off the coast of Ecuador. And ever since early 1970s, a research group has been going to Galapagos every year, and they catch the population. These are Galapagos Islands are a bunch of small islands, and they go to one particular island which is called Daphne Major, and they look at the birds every year, and depending on and they quantify the beak size of a particular kind of a bird, and you see this is changing with time, and this is natural selection in action, because so this year I'm guessing must have been a particularly dry year. As a result of this, the food that you would get to eat is hard nuts, and for hard nuts you need short beaks. The longer beaks are going to break when you're trying to crack open a nut. So this is an evolution happened because of a sudden change in environment. So there's been this change over the decades. Again, this group's work is particularly fascinating. If you want, I'll be happy to share the references. Okay, so natural selection operates. A few different things. Darwin discusses this in a few. So variation can exist beneficial, which are good beneficials. What Darwin called injurious variations, which are now referred to as deleterious variations. And you could also have variations which are neither beneficial nor injurious, which is now referred to as a neutral variation. So if selection is not acting on height of human beings, then variation in height is just a neutral variation. Something that Darwin was actually wrong about was the element of time, because he keeps on emphasizing that breeders bring about change in a short time, and nature has so much more time at her disposal to bring about evolutionary change. But it's really hard for us to see it because our lives are short and so on and so forth. Can we think of examples of quote unquote rapid evolution where we can see it happen right before our eyes?
The case of the moths?
Yes. Yes, others? Other examples? So moths was fairly rapid, you're right.
Sir, where the generation time is very short, the evolution is rapid.
Give me an example. So Pavitra, something from our time here.
So viruses.
Okay, more precise.
In a macroorganism, sir, this COVID has a new strain. It's evolution.
Yes, exactly. Right. So now people are worried that whether on this new variant of SARS-CoV-2, whether the vaccine that people have been working on is going to work or not. That's evolution taking place, right? Antibiotic resistance is another case. In some time, excuse me. Yeah. So in sometime in the 20th century, HIV, which was then SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, jumped hosts from chimps to human beings. And that was another example of evolution. So evolution can be rapid also. But you're right in the sense that generation time is small. Hence, if generation time is small, then you can process a lot of generations in a very short amount of time. And greater the number of generations, greater is the chance of evolution. He discusses these 2 or 3 issues: pleiotropy, sexual selection, and hermaphrodites. I don't want to go over them. I mean, if we had time, I would. If you have questions about any of these aspects, we can start with it the next time. But what I did want to show, why do hermaphrodites not mate within themselves, but mate with a partner? Why do hermaphrodites not exist in nature so much is a question. Sexual selection was the other one, and pleiotropy, which Darwin calls unknown laws of correlation, are some of the aspects that he talks about in this chapter. And I just wanted to show you this, that the nature of variation, which is the neutral mutation, good variants, bad variants, this is something that's being worked on now. This is 2010. This is last year from our group. Pleiotropy is another thing that Darwin talks about. This is 2010. This is 2019. Sexual selection, there's a ton of work on sexual selection. Again, this is last year. This is 2010. So all of these issues that he talks about in chapter 4 are extremely, extremely relevant today. And the details of what Darwin was talking about are actually just beginning to be understood now. This is a curious case, the Habsburg jaw, that I'll talk about next time. We'll start with this. So let's close for today. Couple of things. One is that we'll start with Habsburg jaw, then move to criticisms of the theory of natural selection, what Darwin pointed out himself and what he wanted, what others pointed out. We'll discuss that. But I would like to start by hearing from you that, having read chapter 4, what elements of the theory of natural selection you felt dissatisfied by. You don't have to look up anything, but if you just think about it, and if there was something that just didn't strike a chord, you felt that the argument didn't really convince you, I will have a small discussion and then start with the limitations that Darwin perceived himself and others pointed out as well. And those of you who haven't submitted the summaries, I would like to know why that has been the case. Okay, we're almost out of time. Let's close for today, and I will see you guys on Friday.
Yes, sir. When do we have to submit the summary? I just mailed you because I couldn't find the link.
Oh, sure. If you just, I said email it to me. So if you mailed it, that's fine. That was what you were supposed to do. Yeah.
And the time was before today's lecture, right?
Before 9:30 a.m. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Tumhara mil gaya.
Okay.
All right. Feel free to leave. If you have questions, I can stay back for a few more minutes, but more logistics type of question rather than scientific ones. Otherwise, feel free to leave.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Bye, sir.
Thank you, sir.